interesting aspect around this is that these countries have developed very differently, and there's some interesting stories that can be seen in those. I'd also split the countries into two groups of three, where New Zealand, South Africa, and the United States have a very consistent story of growth and profit over the last 17 years. Whereas I would then put Uruguay, Argentina, and Australia in another group that at different stages have struggled to grow their milk supply, and I believe that points to challenges or problems that those countries have. So the most extraordinary story, or the best story, I have to admit, is for New Zealand, which has retained a high level of profitability even when milk prices have gone up and down during that time, and a low cost of production, which has been the key. And they have continued to go from strength to strength over that time. I think the most problematic or the worst story is for my own country, Australia, which over that entire 17-year period has gone backwards. Milk supply has been dropping, and it points to a situation where there's not enough profitability. So farmers aren't able to reinvest in their business, and they no longer have other people who want to invest in the dairy business. And unfortunately, it's very sad, but that's continuing to happen, and I don't see any change there. I'm going to talk about South Africa, which is this extraordinary story of a country that, although is domestically focused in its milk supply, it had been developing in the late 20th century through into the 1990s, where it had been adopting lots of practice out of the United States, bigger cows, more concentrate feeding, higher levels of milk per cow, but profitability had been dropping very badly. And it's a story of a turnaround, and that country recognised their problems and made some major changes, reduced the cost of production, changed their production system, and has become a very profitable and very strong country. The United States continues to be I think the United States is a very efficient, highly productive industry, like most things in the United States, applying capital carefully, and has had very consistent growth. And a big story out of the United States is that they've become a significant exporter, and I think actually quite a big threat to Uruguay, Argentina, Australia, even New Zealand. And then we get to Uruguay and Argentina, and although both grew very significantly, especially Uruguay, through to about 2012, growth since then has been either negligible or, in Argentina's case, negative. And I believe those two countries have unfortunately followed Australia down a path of much higher levels of cost of production by chasing more milk and more concentrate feeding, less pasture in the diet. And I'm going to be talking about, is there a way for that to change? Firstly, is it correct? And how is that correct? And is there an opportunity for Uruguay in particular, but for all three of these countries, Uruguay, Argentina and Australia, to change and improve? The most important thing I might say to start with is for farmers to analyse their profitability and make sure they understand what's happening and which ratios or which parts of the business financially are progressing well and which are not. And I think, like in all countries, if more what I describe as a full or comprehensive business analysis is done, then at least a farmer and people within the industry can track progress. what is essential for long-term profitability and sustainability is that cost of production remains low. It underpins any farmers and any country being able to, who need to export, like Uruguay and Australia and Argentina. A low cost production will allow that country to produce milk and market it internationally. And there's a group of ways, to break down cost of production to look at it, but it must be kept low. And the beauty is that a low cost of production will always increase profit, but it will also reduce risk in a business. And usually those two things don't go hand in hand, but in dairy farming they do. So then it's understanding what it is that will keep cost of production down. And the key with that is that if you've bought a dairy business with pasture involved, then it's pasture that keeps the cost down. And it has to be grown and harvested cost effectively. And more, as importantly, is the proportion or the percentage of pasture in the diet must stay up at a reasonably high level, or otherwise the additional costs associated with supplements and then the type of cows required to eat those supplements and convert them become too great. So that is actually the key. I'll walk through each of the 6 countries, but I'll start with those that are growing fastest. And New Zealand has been growing at around 3% year on year in growth in milk supply, and it looks to be in a very strong position to continue with good growth. I am expecting that growth to be a little lower, more like 1.5% to 2% year on year, because the amount of land in New Zealand that can be converted to dairying is much smaller now. There's very little that can be converted from beef production or lamb production into dairying, which has been one of the strong factors given how successful the industry has been. The United States, I just expect to keep on growing at around 2% year on year. They've been doing it very consistently. What's interesting is they've been doing it in good times and bad times. They're the most consistent for just moving at a moderate pace, but a very consistent pace year on year. But the key that impacts on us, whether it's Uruguay, Australia, is that over the same period from 2003 to 2018-19, they've moved from exporting 5% of their milk to 16% of the milk. And that amount of milk is not quite as much, but is not far off the amount of milk that in total that Argentina, Uruguay, South Africa and Australia produce. And if they keep going, they're going to help supply what the world requires, and the world may not require us to produce more milk, which would be very sad. South Africa, I think, will have the highest growth. They have a high population growth. They've been growing at between 3% and 4% year on year. I believe that will just keep going. So now we get into the countries with the problems. Australia has been producing less and less each year, and it's very sad for me to say I expect that to continue. 17 years of going backwards, and there is no discussion in the industry there of the real problems, which is sad. If you don't talk about the problems, and if people don't make a plan, how will anything change? Argentina has, having grown at a little under 2% year on year through to 2012, has been going backwards as well since then, has had negative growth. I think that maybe they will have a small amount of growth, although I would say that the data doesn't support that. But it's Argentina and anything's possible. So I think maybe a small amount of growth. So Uruguay through the 17-year period had the highest growth, well over 4% year on year, but that also stopped in 2012. And interestingly, that very high level of growth was aided by what was then known as New Zealand Farming Systems Uruguay, adding substantially to that growth for a period. But over the last 7 or 8 years, the growth has been around zero, slightly more. I think that should increase a little, but I wouldn't expect the growth to be more than, say, 1%. And that's unfortunate. It could well not be positive. So for those 3 countries without strong growth, the key is will any of those countries will enough farmers recognise that their farm systems have changed and reduced their level of profitability? If there's not profit, there cannot be growth. You have to have a profitable industry so the existing farmers reinvest and keep building their businesses, and for dairying in Uruguay to be sufficiently positive compared to beef farming or agriculture, cropping, for some of those farmers to say, actually, I think I'd like to do some dairying as well, or maybe for some people to invest and make some of those farms into dairying. So that's the challenge. There has to be some change, in my view, and that's what I'm looking forward to talking about. The changes that would need to be made, or what I would like to think the industry might change, is entirely related to how the cost of production might be reduced. So there's a nice gap between the cost of production and what the price of milk would be reasonably expected to be. To reduce the cost of production, then the production system will have to change, which means pushing the system where there is a higher proportion of pasture in the diet, a system where there is less supplement as part of the diet. So less supplement, a lower cost of supplement per litre, less concentrates being fed, and less other imported supplements or crops being grown and conserved and fed. So a system that's more strongly based on pasture, and the concern is to do that is that potentially the type of cow needs to change. When I was here and part of the industry, I don't think I recognised strongly enough how important this was, and that to have a cow that can thrive and do well and get in calf in a climate like Uruguay or Argentina, it's where South Africa is very similar and interesting, and to not get as much concentrate, it cannot be a strong US type cow. It has to have more genetics. That means it thrives, it puts more energy into body weight so that it retains its body condition and gets in calf than the average or the normal cow in Uruguay or Argentina. And it's very noticeable in the Australian data as well, that's where we have got bigger, nicer looking cows in Australia than ever before. We're producing more milk per cow than ever before, and we are making less money than ever before, to the extent the industry is doing terribly. So that's, and the farm system may also need to change in other ways. There are many farmers in this area that calve all year round, and it's very difficult to have a low cost of production, and it's a big challenge for the dairy processors as well. If more farmers were allowed to, say, calve twice a year, once in spring and once in autumn, let's say a slightly different cow, these are the changes, and it's it's this huge challenge and problem with industries when they head down the track that South Africa did and reversed and came to be a very strong and good, profitable place compared to these other countries, is that you can't change overnight. If I said, if I met a farmer and I said, you've got only 45% of pasture in the diet and you could be much more profitable with 55 or 60%, and they immediately changed and removed some of the concentrate, the type of cow would collapse, would be a problem. And this is why it's not a quick fix, why people, it's a real big challenge, is that when people have bred the wrong cow for a low cost of production system, you can't change until you change the cow. And we talk a lot about this in Australia and some other countries that have got a problem. Is it the cow that determines what production system you have? Or is it the farmer? Is it the farmer who wants to make money who determines it? The wrong cow, you are several years away from being able to change to a better place. But these are the challenges.